The clinic was a cathedral of silence and wealth, perched on the serene shores of Lake Geneva. It was a place where billionaires came to bargain with mortality, where the air itself smelled of money and antiseptic. Dr. Eris Thorne moved through its hushed, white corridors with a quiet efficiency that belied the fierce intelligence in her sharp, gray eyes. At 34, she was a rising star in the world of experimental cellular therapies, a physician who believed in data, in peer-reviewed studies, and in the elegant, observable dance of molecules. She did not believe in miracles, which was why her newest patient, the shipping magnate Konstantin Volkov, was becoming the single greatest challenge of her professional life. Volkov was dying. His body was being systematically dismantled by a rare, aggressive form of motor neuron disease for which there was no cure, only a slow, humiliating decline. He was a man accustomed to bending the world to his will, and he now found his own body in open rebellion. He had poured millions into Eris's research, funding the very clinic she worked in, all for a cure that remained stubbornly out of reach. On this particular Tuesday, Volkov was different. The fog of despair that usually clouded his sharp features had been replaced by a feverish, almost manic gleam. "We can stop the official treatments, doctor," he announced, his voice a hoarse whisper from the confines of his state-of-the-art wheelchair. "I have found something else. Something more organic." He gestured a trembling hand toward a small, refrigerated case on his bedside table. It was matte black, with no labels or branding, and it unlocked with a biometric thumbprint. Inside, nestled in a bed of black satin, was a single, heavy crystal vial. The liquid within was viscous and faintly iridescent, but it was the vial's living contents that made Eris take an involuntary step back. Suspended in the fluid were a dozen leeches, but these were unlike any she had ever seen in medicine or nature. They were not the dark, earthy green of Hirudo medicinalis. These creatures were a pale, ghostly silver, their bodies shimmering with a metallic luster. They moved with a slow, hypnotic grace, their forms seeming to catch and refract the light. "They call it the Argent Purge," Volkov whispered, his eyes fixed on the vial with a reverence that chilled Eris to the bone. "From a boutique aquaculture farm in England. Very exclusive. They cultivate a unique, parasitic strain. The theory, as it was explained to me, is that these creatures, when introduced to the system, do not merely draw blood. They are biological filters. They seek out and consume the misfolded proteins, the cellular debris, the very source of the disease. They purge the body of its imperfections." Eris stared, horrified. "Konstantin, this is madness. There is no science to support this. No trials. This is predatory quackery of the highest order." "Where did you get this?" "A source," he said evasively, his pride stung. "A very reliable, very expensive source. The man who runs the facility, a Dr. Finch, is a visionary. He understands that nature has already created the perfect machines. We just need the courage to use them." Against every medical and ethical protocol, against her own desperate pleas, Volkov began the treatment that night. Eris refused to administer it, but she could not stop him. She was his doctor, not his jailer. As the clinic's private nurse applied the shimmering leeches to Volkov's skin, Eris could only watch on a monitor, her stomach twisting into a cold, hard knot. The creatures latched on with an unnatural eagerness, their silvery bodies slowly plumping and darkening as they fed. Meanwhile, over 800 miles away, in the flat, misty fenlands of Cambridgeshire, Alistair Finch was tending to his livestock. Fenreach Aquacultures was a place that existed out of time, a collection of low, slate-roofed buildings and sprawling, covered pools shrouded in the perpetual damp grey of the fens. To the outside world, and to the UK's medical regulators, it was a state-of-the-art facility for the breeding of medicinal leeches for hospitals and research labs. Finch was a registered biologist, a man with impeccable credentials and a quiet, academic demeanor that inspired confidence. He published papers on anticoagulants and lectured on the benefits of hirudotherapy. But the real work at Fenreach happened in a place no regulator ever saw. It happened in Barndsea, a long, windowless structure at the far end of the property, surrounded by a high-security fence and infrared cameras. The air inside Barnes C was thick, warm, and foul with the coppery sweet stench of decay. It did not smell of a laboratory. It smelled of an abattoir. Inside, row upon row of large fiberglass tanks were illuminated by a pale, sterile light. This was the heart of the Argent Purge. This was where Alastair Finch cultivated his masterpiece, his unique, patented strain of parasite. And the nutrient medium, the secret ingredient that gave them their spectral shimmer and their supposed purging abilities, was human flesh. Alastair Finch was not a sadist. In his own mind, he was a pragmatist, a visionary. He saw the world as a system of wasted resources. Every year, thousands of people vanished from the fringes of society, the homeless, the addicted, the undocumented souls who had, in his view, already been discarded. They would die in an alley, a squat, or a ditch, and their bodies would simply rot, their biological potential squandered. Alastair saw this as an unforgivable inefficiency. He was a recycler. He was, in his own twisted way, giving these forgotten lives a new, final purpose. His process was coldly efficient. He had a network of suppliers in London and other major cities, predatory men who ran shelters or soup kitchens, who could identify the truly isolated. For a few £1,000s, they would deliver a new subject to a discreet drop-off point. The subject would be sedated, brought to the farm, and painlessly euthanized. Alastair was not cruel. He was merely harvesting a resource. The bodies were then processed in a refrigerated, stainless steel room, the flesh and organs rendered into a nutrient-rich slurry that was piped directly into the breeding tanks. He believed his theory was sound. He theorized that by feeding on a human host, the leeches absorbed more than just proteins and fats. They absorbed a kind of life force, an essential biological signature that, when reintroduced into a new, living host, could trigger a powerful regenerative response. The silvery sheen of their skin was a byproduct of a heavy metal filtration system he had engineered, but it made for brilliant marketing. He was selling a story as much as a product. A story of purity, nature, and radical rejuvenation. And the desperate, dying rich were buying it at a cost of €1 million per treatment. On the same night that Konstantin Volkov was applying his first vial of leeches, Alastair was introducing a new batch of nutrients into Tank 7. The donor, a young man who had been living on the streets of London, had been processed hours earlier. Alastair adjusted the temperature and pH levels on a digital monitor, his movements calm and precise. He watched as the swarms of silver leeches converged on the feeding tubes, their bodies undulating in a hungry, hypnotic dance. He felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He was a creator, a healer, a god in his own small, muddy kingdom. Back in Geneva, the initial results of Volkov's treatment were baffling. For the first week, he seemed to rally. A small amount of motor function returned to his left hand. The tremors in his legs lessened. He was euphoric, hailing Finch as a genius and Eris as a short-sighted fool. Eris was stunned. She ran every test she could think of. His blood work was anomalous, showing a host of unidentifiable proteins and a dangerously low platelet count, but he felt better. The placebo effect could be powerful, she reasoned, but this seemed to be more. Then, on the 8th day, the decline began. It was not a return to his previous state. It was a horrifying new trajectory. He developed a series of strange, circular lesions on his skin where the leeches had attached. They were not infected. They were necrotic, as if the tissue was simply dying from the inside out. He became weak, delirious. His body, which had already been thin, began to waste away at an accelerated rate. His skin taking on a strange, translucent, almost silvery pallor. It was as if the leeches hadn't just taken his blood. They had taken something more fundamental, leaving an insatiable emptiness in their wake. Eris worked frantically, trying to understand what was happening. She had managed to secure one of the used leeches from his medical waste before it was incinerated. In her private lab, late at night, she dissected it under a high-powered microscope. What she found made her blood run cold. The leech's digestive tract was teeming with human DNA, which was to be expected. But when she ran a deeper analysis, she found it contained DNA from dozens of distinct, unidentifiable individuals. It was a genetic soup. This creature hadn't been bred in a sterile lab. It had been fed on people. The revelation was so monstrous, so far beyond the pale of medical ethics, that she could barely process it. This wasn't a medicine. It was a vector. It was a form of cannibalism by proxy. Konstantin Volkov died on the 12th day of his treatment. His body was a skeletal ruin, his organs in a state of catastrophic failure. The official cause of death was listed as complications from his disease, but Eris knew he had been consumed, not by his illness but by his cure. Her grief for her patient was quickly superseded by a cold, hard rage. Someone was feeding the dying to the dying and calling it medicine. Her Hippocratic oath, her entire sense of scientific and moral order, demanded that she expose it. After Volkov's funeral, she submitted her resignation to the clinic, citing personal reasons. She packed a single bag, booked a flight to London, and using the scant information she could find on the shell corporations that handled Volkov's payments, she began to follow the money trail. Her destination was a quiet, damp corner of England, and a man named Alastair Finch. She wasn't just looking for answers anymore. She was hunting a monster. In the Fens, Alastair Finch received the news of Volkov's death with a detached, academic interest. He logged it in his private files. Subject experienced initial rejuvenation followed by rapid systemic collapse. Post-rejection? Or is the elixir too potent for a system already in terminal decline? He felt no guilt. It was simply a failed experiment. There were other clients, other desperate souls lining up to pay for his miracle cure. He made a note to adjust the feeding schedule for the next batch, then went back to his work, the soft, wet sounds of the farm a comforting symphony of industry and progress. The Cambridgeshire Fens were a world away from the pristine, orderly beauty of Geneva. It was a vast, flat landscape that seemed to have been bled of all color, stretched out beneath an immense, indifferent sky. A persistent, chilling mist clung to the ground, blurring the edges of the fields and muffling all sound. It was a place that seemed to actively swallow secrets, and as Dr. Eris Thorne drove her rented car down the narrow, muddy lane toward Fenreach Aquacultures, she felt a profound sense of isolation that was both tactical and terrifying. After weeks of painstaking, frustrating work in London, tracing shell corporations and encrypted communications, she had finally found it. The farm was the nexus, the source of the Argent Purge. Her initial plan had been to go to the authorities, to lay out her horrific discovery from the dissected leech. But what did she really have? The ramblings of a dead patient, a single parasite from a questionable source, and a wild theory about cannibalism by proxy. They would think she was mad. She needed irrefutable proof, something that could not be dismissed or buried by high-priced lawyers. She needed to get inside. Posing as Dr. Eleanor Vance, a freelance biologist researching parasitic ecosystems for a new textbook, she had secured an appointment with Alastair Finch. The cover was thin, but it was the best she could devise. She had fabricated credentials, a university email address, and a detailed research proposal. She was banking on Finch's academic vanity to grant her access. The farm, when she arrived, was exactly as she'd pictured it. Functional, isolated, and unervingly quiet. Alastair Finch met her at the door of the main administrative building. He was not what she had expected. There were no outward signs of the monster she imagined. He was a man in his late 50s, tall and slender, with a tweed jacket, kind, intelligent eyes, and a gentle, professorial manner. He spoke with a soft, precise diction, and he seemed genuinely delighted to meet a fellow academic. Dr. Vance, a pleasure, he said, shaking her hand. His grip was firm and dry. It's a rare treat to speak with someone who appreciates the subtle beauty of these remarkable organisms. Most people, I'm afraid, find them rather unsavory. He gave her the grand tour. The facilities were immaculate. She saw the public-facing labs, the rows of carefully monitored tanks where he bred standard medicinal leeches for the NHS. He showed her his shipping manifests, his health and safety certifications, his sterile packaging facility. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. He was a man showing her a meticulously crafted lie. "And your specialized strains?" she asked, keeping her voice casual. "The ones for private research? I've read some fascinating monographs online about unique cultivars with enhanced therapeutic properties." A flicker of something caution perhaps crossed Finch's eyes before he smiled. "Ah yes, my passion projects. Those are housed in a separate biosecure facility. Proprietary research, you understand. I'm afraid access is highly restricted." He was stonewalling her politely and effectively. As the tour concluded, Eris knew a single visit would yield nothing. As she drove away from the farm, a new, far more dangerous plan began to form in her mind. If she couldn't get in through the front door, she would have to find another way. Meanwhile, a different kind of hunter was closing in on Fenreach, albeit from a completely different direction. Detective Inspector Frank Gable of the Cambridgeshire Constabulary was a man on the verge of retirement. He was a rumpled, overweight detective of the old school, powered by lukewarm tea and a stubborn refusal to let any file be closed until every last thread had been pulled. His current obsession was a series of missing persons cases that no one else seemed to care about. Over the past 2 years, at least 5 homeless men, all with no family or connections, had vanished from the streets of Cambridge and Peterborough. The cases were cold, with no leads and no witnesses. But Gable had found a thread, a single, tenuous connection. The last known sighting of 2 of the men, according to a soup kitchen volunteer, was of them getting into a plain white transit van. The volunteer had thought it odd and had jotted down a partial license plate. For months, the partial plate had led nowhere. But a new traffic camera database had recently come online, and Gable, in a fit of late-night inspiration, had run the partial plate through it. He got a match. A white van, registered to a company called Fenreach Aquacultures, had been pinged by a camera near the soup kitchen on the night of the second man's disappearance. It was thin, could be a coincidence, but it was more than he'd had in months. The official line was that the men had simply moved on. But 5 of them all disappearing without a trace? Gable's finely honed policeman's senses told him something was wrong. He decided it was time to pay a social call on the Leach farm. His visit came 2 days after Eris's. He found Alistair Finch just as charming and plausible as she had. Gable asked about the van, and Finch produced a logbook showing the van had been in London that day, picking up specialized filtration equipment. The driver's logs were all in order. "We do a lot of outreach, Inspector," Finch said smoothly, his expression one of civic concern. "We sometimes offer itinerant workers a day's labor for cash. Clearing ditches, groundskeeping. Perhaps one of your missing men worked for us for a day and simply moved on. They often do." It was a perfect explanation. Plausible, charitable, and utterly dismissive. Gable left the farm with the same feeling Eris had. A profound sense of unease, a feeling that he had just been expertly managed. He had seen nothing to warrant a search, but the neatness of Finch's answers only deepened his suspicion. The man was too prepared. Eris, undeterred, put her new plan into motion. She couldn't get a job at the farm. Her fabricated identity as a high-level biologist wouldn't stand up to a real background check for employment. She needed to get onto the property at night. She spent 2 days observing Fenreach from a distance, using a pair of powerful binoculars. She mapped the camera locations, the patrol patterns of the single night watchman, the electronic keypad on the gate of the notorious Barndsea. The place was a fortress. But every fortress has a weakness. Eris found it in the drainage system. A large culvert ran from a drainage ditch in the adjacent faun, under the perimeter fence, and ended in a grated outflow pipe near the back of Barndsea. It was designed to handle the runoff from the farm's extensive water systems. The grate was heavy iron, likely rusted shut. It was a long shot, a disgusting, dangerous shot, but it was the only way in she could see. On the 3rd night, under the sliver of a new moon, she made her move. Dressed in black, her face smeared with mud, she waded into the cold, foul-smelling water of the ditch. The culvert was claustrophobically tight, the stench of stagnant water and decay overwhelming. Rats scurried past her in the darkness. After a 10-minute, heart-pounding crawl, she reached the grate. As she'd feared, It was secured with rusted bolts. Using a small, powerful wrench from a tool kit she carried, she worked on the bolts, her muscles screaming in protest, the sound of the metal groaning seeming to echo for miles in the dead quiet of the night. Finally, with a gut-wrenching screech of metal, one of the bolts gave way. Then another. She was able to pry the grate open just enough to squeeze through. She emerged into the shadow of Barn C, covered in filth, shivering, but inside. The barn itself was a new challenge. The doors and windows were locked down tight, but her surveillance had paid off. She had noted a large ventilation fan high on the back wall. Its cover was held in place by simple screws. Using a compact, battery-powered screwdriver, she quickly removed the cover and, after another terrifying, tight squeeze, she was in. She dropped silently to the concrete floor, and the smell hit her. It was the smell from her nightmares, the smell of the dissected leech, magnified 1,000 times. The cloying, metallic stench of blood and death. The air was warm and humid, filled with the soft, wet, slithering sounds of thousands upon thousands of living creatures. Her small flashlight cut a nervous beam through the darkness, revealing the rows of massive fiberglass tanks. They were just as she had imagined, but seeing them in person, feeling the monstrous reality of this place, was a physical blow. She crept to the nearest tank and shone her light through the murky viewing portal. A mass of pale, silver bodies writhed within, a roiling carpet of nightmare creatures. But it was what they were feeding on that made her retch. Floating in the nutrient-rich water were lumps of tissue, fragments of bone, and what looked horrifically like a human hand, stripped of its skin. She had her proof. Fighting back waves of nausea and terror, she took out her phone, her hands shaking so badly she could barely operate it. She began to take pictures, to record videos, her light panning across the grotesque contents of the tank. This was it. This was the evidence that would burn Alistair Finch to the ground. Suddenly, the overhead lights flashed on, blinding her. "I must confess, Dr. Vance, I did not expect you to be quite so resourceful." Alistair Finch stood at the far end of the barn by the main door. He was no longer the charming academic. His face was cold, his eyes devoid of all warmth. In his hand he held a tranquilizer rifle. "I had my suspicions after your visit," he said, his calm voice a terrifying counterpoint to the horror surrounding them. "Your research proposal was just a little too vague. A few discreet inquiries confirmed that the university you claimed to represent has never heard of you. I've had my staff monitoring the perimeter since you left." Eris's heart hammered against her ribs. She was trapped. "You're a monster," she breathed, her voice trembling. "No, Doctor," Finch replied, taking a slow step towards her. "I am a pioneer. You are standing in the future of medicine. It's a shame you won't be able to appreciate it. We are always in need of new donors, and your healthy, untainted biology will make for a particularly potent batch." He raised the rifle. Eris didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, not for the door, but deeper into the labyrinth of tanks, plunging the barn into a terrifying game of cat and mouse. The soft, wet sounds she had heard before now seemed to her like the chewing of a million hungry mouths, waiting for their next meal. The barn was a labyrinth of horrors. The air, thick with the stench of death, was a suffocating blanket. The only sounds were Eris's ragged breaths, the soft hum of the filtration pumps, and the chillingly calm footsteps of Alistair Finch as he stalked her through the rows of his grotesque harvest. Every shadow seemed to writhe. Every splash from within the tanks sounded like a skeletal hand reaching for her. "There is no escape, Dr. Thorne," Finch's voice echoed through the vast space. He knew her real name. The realization sent a fresh spike of terror through her. "I am nothing if not thorough. Your rental car, your real identity. It was all remarkably easy to find. You should have stayed in your sterile little clinic in Geneva." Eris ducked behind a large control panel, her mind racing. He was right. There was no way out. The doors were sealed, and the vent she had entered through was too high to reach from the inside. Panic was a cold tide, rising in her throat, but she fought it down. She was a scientist, She had to think, to analyze, to find a variable she could manipulate. Her eyes darted around her hiding place. The control panel was a complex array of switches, dials, and digital readouts, monitoring the life support systems for the tank space, temperature, oxygen levels, and something labeled nutrient distribution. A thick bundle of pipes and conduits ran from the panel along the floor, branching off to each individual tank. This was the barn's central nervous system, and she was going to give it a catastrophic shock. She could hear Finch's footsteps growing closer. She didn't have time to understand the system, only to disrupt it. With a prayer to whatever God might be listening, she began to hit buttons and turn dials at random. Alarms began to blare, shrill and piercing. Red lights flashed across the control panel, casting the room in a hellish, pulsating glow. A futile gesture, Finch's voice called out, closer now. You are merely upsetting the livestock. But Eris had seen one critical dial labeled Primary Disinfectant Flush Emergency Use Only. It was covered with a clear plastic guard. Smashing it with the heel of her boot, she grabbed the large, red lever beneath it and pulled down with all her strength. A deep, shuddering groan vibrated through the floor as a powerful pump kicked into life somewhere beneath her feet. A chemical smell, sharp and sterile, began to fill the air. Through the viewing portals of the nearest tank, she saw the water begin to cloud as a concentrated cleaning agent, likely a powerful base or chlorine solution, was injected directly into the system. The silver leeches, which had been swarming placidly, began to writhe in agony, convulsing as their environment turned toxic. It was the distraction she needed. As Finch rounded the corner of the tank, his attention momentarily diverted by the wailing alarms and the sight of his precious creations being poisoned, Eris charged. She didn't run away. She ran at him. She slammed her shoulder into his side, catching him off balance. The tranquilizer rifle flew from his grasp, clattering across the concrete floor. The move surprised him, but he was stronger than he looked. He grabbed her, his fingers like steel claws digging into her arms. They struggled, a desperate, clumsy dance between the vats of dying abominations. He was driven by a cold fury at the destruction of his life's work. She was driven by the primal, incandescent will to survive. Meanwhile, D.I. Frank Gable's unease had festered into full-blown suspicion. Finch's alibi had been too perfect, his farm too clean. After leaving Fenreach, he had put a 24-hour watch on the property, an unorthodox move for a series of forgotten missing persons cases, but his gut screamed at him that this was the place. His vigil paid off. His man on watch reported a figure dressed in black breaking into the farm. And just this morning, a rental car had been found abandoned on a nearby lane, registered to a Dr. Eris Thorne, a Swiss medical researcher who had, according to the rental company, been reported missing by her concerned hotel. It all clicked into place. The missing men, the secretive farm, and now a missing doctor who had clearly been investigating it. Gable finally had enough, not for a warrant, but for what the force called an exigent circumstances welfare check. He could legally enter the property if he had reason to believe someone's life was in immediate danger, and he was certain Eris Thorne's life was hanging by a thread. He arrived at Fenreach with 2 squad cars, sirens blaring, cutting through the morning mist. They found the main buildings empty, but as they approached Barn C, they heard the faint, piercing sound of the alarms. Finding the main door electronically locked, they didn't hesitate. A uniformed officer used a battering ram to splinter the door from its frame. They burst into a scene from a nightmare. The flashing red lights, the cacophony of the alarms, the overwhelming stench, and the sight of the writhing, dying creatures in the tanks. And in the center of the room, Alistair Finch had Eris in a chokehold, trying to drag her towards the open hatch of a massive central processing vat, the very heart of his foul operation. "Drop it, Finch!" Gable yelled, his service weapon drawn and steady. Finch froze, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He saw the police, saw his kingdom in ruins, his secrets laid bare. Everything he had built was collapsing around him. But he was not a man who would accept defeat. He would not spend his life in a cage. With a final, desperate snarl, he shoved Eris away from him, sending her sprawling to the floor. Then, Before anyone could react, he turned and climbed onto the walkway surrounding the central vat. He looked down at the swirling, churning slurry of gore and poison and his own dying creations. "You are fools," he screamed, his voice echoing above the din. "You reject salvation. You choose to rot, to be wasted. I chose to be a part of the cycle, to be reborn." And with that, he threw himself over the railing, plunging into the tank. There was a great splash, followed by a moment of horrifying silence. His body did not resurface. He had offered himself up in a final, grotesque sacrament to the monsters he had created, consumed by his own horrific invention. The aftermath was a whirlwind of activity that sent shockwaves from the quiet fens across the globe. The horrors discovered in Barnsea became an international scandal. A forensics team spent weeks draining the tanks, cataloging the human remains. They eventually identified over 15 individuals, including the 5 homeless men from Gable's cold cases. The farm was dismantled, the ground itself declared a biohazard. Eris, though bruised and traumatized, worked tirelessly with Gable and international authorities. Using Finch's meticulously kept and encrypted records, which they recovered from his computer, they were able to compile a list of his wealthy clients. Quiet, discreet arrests were made in Zurich, Hong Kong, and Dubai. The world's elite were horrified to learn that the elixir of life they had been injecting was, in fact, an essence of death, distilled through parasites fed on the flesh of the forgotten. Weeks later, Eris and Gable stood on a small bridge overlooking the Great Ouse River, the gray, flat landscape of the fens stretching out around them. The air was clean now, the nightmare of Fenreach contained. "They're calling you a hero, you know," Gable said, looking at her. "The press." Eris shook her head, pulling her coat tighter against the chill wind. "I'm not a hero. I just couldn't let it stand. All those people, used as raw material, thrown away so that men like Volkov could have a few more months of denial. The horror wasn't just what Finch did, Frank. It was that he was able to do it because he knew no one was looking for his victims." Gable nodded, his weary face etched with a sad understanding. "Well," he said, a grim satisfaction in his voice, "we looked. We finally looked." Eris knew the memory of Barnsea would never leave her. She would forever be haunted by the sight of the silver leeches, the smell of death, and the chilling, rational voice of Alistair Finch explaining his philosophy of recycling human souls. She was returning to medicine, but not to the pristine clinics of the wealthy. She was going to work in public health, in the places where people fell through the cracks, the very places Finch had seen as his private hunting ground. She could not undo the horror, but she could stand watch over the forgotten, ensuring that their lives would be counted, their absence noted, and that they would never again end up as nothing more than feedstock for a monster's cure.